Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Tharby,
And I'm Shaun Allison.
and we're the writers of Making Every Lesson Count. And we thought we would do this recording this evening to talk about the six principles from the book, and to talk today about how you might implement them in a school. Um, We'd just like to say that we are at the moment beginning to write the second version of Making Every Lesson Count, and much of what we talk about today will be included in the book, we hope. So we thought we'd start by having a think about what the original catalyst for writing the book was.
Yeah, so it's quite hard to think back to that now, Tharbs, isn't it? But I think it was you know getting a bit irritated with loads of fads and gimmicks that permeated education, that were resulting in teachers having to jump through lots of hoops and perhaps frame their teaching around stuff that had no evidence behind it, um, but were kind of satisfy lots of tick boxes that were pretty prevalent at the time, really. And as we started to become interested in an evidence-informed approach to teaching, and we started reading things such as Rosenshine's principles, and I think it was around that time that the Sutton Trust report came out, What Makes Great Teaching, wasn't it? We felt that it would be useful to try and sort of codify all of that busy classroom teachers, didn't we?
That's right, and it was an exciting time, really, wasn't it? Back about 5 or 6 years ago, when people were seemed to be becoming free of some of the shackles, and we felt at the time that yes, there was a lot of this research evidence out there, and we were reading it and getting excited about it. But as you say, there was no real framework in place for how in an ordinary school in England, teaching ordinary children, how that might look. Particularly, we were focused at a classroom level, weren't we? At what a teacher could do every day to improve their practice.
And I think it's fair to say that at the time there was a real disconnect, wasn't there, between educational researchers in academia and school leaders and school teachers. And I think researchers weren't necessarily researching the things that are always useful for teachers, and teachers weren't using the research or trying to mobilize the available research that was out there. So I think that was something else that we were conscious of, wasn't it? Trying to, because at the time it's hard to believe it now, but research schools weren't in existence at that time, were they? So there's a growing interest, wasn't there, in research evidence. It would be silly to say that wasn't out there, but I mean it's certainly it's impressive how if we just think back to 5 or 6 years ago, I mean it's come on an awful lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. It really has, and I feel that that when we start to look back at the book, that we were in some ways a little bit naive, I think, at how interested people would be in what we had to say. And I think the research is one key part of the book, but I think that one of the things that people have enjoyed when they've read it is the fact that we've written it from the point of view of ordinary classroom teachers, and we tried to write it very realistically. And we really did think about workload an awful lot. What is realistic for an ordinary teacher on an ordinary timetable to be able to do, and it comes back to something that we've talked about a lot, is about the active ingredients of effective classroom practice. And I think that's what we were trying to get at with the 6 principles, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
What would an ordinary teacher in any subject, what would they do to be an effective teacher? And that was our aim.
Yeah, in a sustainable way.
Yeah.
What could they do day in, day out that they wouldn't have to spend hours preparing, but it was going to make sure that they're mobilizing the best available research that was out there about what's most likely to work. And of course, I haven't mentioned Mr. Clark.
Of course. Would you like to talk about Mr. Clark?
I always like to talk about Mr. Clark. So I was cleaning out the loft, and I came across some of my wife's old school books, and she went to a comprehensive in Porthcawl, South Wales, in the mid-80s, and I came across some of the chemistry books, and she was taught by this chap called Mr. Clark. And I was procrastinating looking through these books, but it was just fascinating the level of work that she did, the expectation that was clearly there. And I just started talking to her, didn't I, about this Mr. Clark. And, her eyes lit up and she just kind of came alive and just started talking about, his massively high expectations of all the students that he taught, how he, was passionate about his subject, how, he didn't allow them to kind of give up easily, his fantastic explanations, all of that. And that it was that sort of mixed with thinking about all this research evidence that just made us think that, we kind of lost our way a little bit, really. And it was time to, bring it back to, something more sensible, really.
Yeah. And that's right. And I think that we mustn't forget that sort of that tacit experience and knowledge that's been built up by so many teachers over so many years.
Yeah.
And I think when we were trying to write the book, what we tried to do was to look at sort of, okay, well, what does the research evidence tell us? What we know at what we knew at that moment in time, and then what were the effective teachers that we knew from our own school, but also those who were blogging at the time as well, and clearly were really, really strong practitioners in the classroom. And we were trying to find where these things sort of overlapped, where the expertise overlapped with the research evidence. So there's a really nice example of a science teacher, Pam McCulloch from our school, wasn't there, who had been using retrieval practice for 30 years because she knew intuitively that actually that if she taught something in science and just left it, the children would forget it. And so she would be using quizzes at the starts of lessons and at different points in the curriculum naturally to support her.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned earlier, Tharbs, a lot of the bloggers, and they were really influential in our thinking as well at the time, weren't they? People like David Didal, Tom Sherrington, who were writing back in at that time as well. Andrew Smith, Andrew Lold, who also, well, speaking for myself, made me, reflect and think an awful lot about, teaching and what I thought was. Well, Is that in your house?
I think it is, yes. There's not much I can do about it.
So what about then, what do you think has been so successful then about the idea of or why do you think that the sort of idea of the 6 principles has been successful?
I think going back to that first thing, sorry?
Even if we do say so ourselves.
Of course. Going back to that first thing about the active ingredients, about stripping teaching down, taking something which is really, really complicated and complex and takes years and years to become an expert in, but making it simple and making it sort of quite easy to follow in many ways. I think that's helped. I also think it's about a common language, and I think school leaders and teachers find it really useful when they use the same language to talk about aspects of teaching and learning, whether it's modelling or practice, whether it's retrieval practice or metacognition or assessment, formative, summative. This language, if it's commonly understood through a group of teachers, and not just within a subject, across subjects, then we can start having meaningful discussions about how to get better. I think that was really important.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly found that at our school, haven't we, Durrington? Our teachers understand, why when we're talking about teaching, things like explanation, modelling, why they're so important. And of course, the whole tight but loose idea, that's been a big thing for us. And I think that was quite, a bit of a sigh of relief moment for a lot of teachers, wasn't it? So what we were saying to them was that you didn't have to teach in the same way, and accepting that how a drama teacher models something is different how a maths teacher models it, but they're doing it for the same reason, and that's fine, and it doesn't have to be the same.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. We've been very lucky in the sense that we haven't had much sort of criticism of the book, have we?
No.
But I think it would be a fair criticism or a fair question of the original book to ask whether our approach is too generic.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is fair, isn't it? But I think that what we've always tried to stress is that it's really important for subjects to take it and own it and make it their own, haven't they? And I think that was important at the time when we were writing the book. Feedback and marking was a really hot topic, wasn't it? And a lot of teachers were being crippled by ridiculous marking policies, and what that made us think about was that it's okay for it to be different. You don't have to have a kind of policy that says every book in every subject has to be marked in a green pen every 2 weeks. Feedback can and should take many varied forms. I think that what we've done is we've kind of tried to frame these active ingredients of effective teaching for teachers and allowed them to have had the freedom to mobilise them themselves, really, I think.
Yeah. I think there's another sort of thing to add on top of that, which is that yes, individual sort of subjects need to interpret it in their own way, but I think there has been a massive push towards talking about curriculum, and it's certainly the hot topic at the moment, and we've been very supportive of that, haven't we?
Yeah.
However, I think schools need to remember that they still need to marry up the quite generic aspects of teaching with the very specific necessities of teaching within a certain subject. And I think it would be a mistake to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I don't know what you think, but actually modelling is an important thing, and it does have a role in every subject, and it does have a role. How children learn is very similar, and it's, although subjects are very different, there are many aspects of learning which are remarkably mirrored across different subjects.
Yeah, because
that's what we were trying to do, and I think that certainly teachers and school leaders need to really think about how their CPD provision both supports those generic features of teaching, but also the teaching of the subject specific content.
Yeah, because there's a school of thought, isn't there, that if you get your curriculum absolutely right, pedagogy becomes less important.
There is a school of thought, but I think researchers such as Dylan William would question that. There isn't necessarily a strong evidence base to support that view.
No.
And certainly through our work with the EF, for instance, most of the guidance has been through quite generic areas, whether it's sort of metacognition or literacy or, how you work with PP students. But then usually when you look closely at the guidance, it will then point out that metacognition, for instance, should be done within subjects. It's domain specific to subjects. So those overarching ideas, I think, are still valid and are still useful for schools to pursue.
Yeah, and I think that the subject versions of the book have borne that out really, because they're great examples of how you can take that framework, but then think about it very much within the context of history or English or science or maths or geography, and I think that's something that we've found that teachers and leaders in all phases have bought into the idea of the six principles, haven't they? It seems to be relevant for all. We had some questions from people. Should we have a think about those?
Yeah.
So the first one was from a certain Mark Enser.
Mark who?
Yeah, you may not have heard of him. He writes for some, I can't even remember what it's called, but yeah. Anyway, his question is this, and it's a good question. With the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you'd now change about milk, especially in light of further reading or research?
Oh, yeah. There are quite a few things. I think when we first wrote the book, we were reading all this research and we just threw it into a book, didn't we? We were trying out a few things in our own classrooms, in our own school, but we hadn't had the benefit of 5 or 6 years of trial and error within our own context, have we?
No.
So, I mean, some of the research evidence, for instance, that we looked at the time, the one that stands out for me is, of course, Carol Dweck's growth mindset.
Yeah.
And I think all of us would still stand firm to the idea that if children sort of attribute success to their own effort rather than something that's sort of innate to them, their ability, and then continue to put more effort in, then they're going to get better. And I don't think there's anybody who would disagree with that. But I think maybe our approach to it, particularly in the opening parts of the book, was quite simplistic.
Yeah.
As if a teacher could miraculously create this sort of general growth mindset in a student, which they would just take into any subject. Because actually the truth of the matter is that once again, our growth mindset is very domain specific, isn't it? So your child might go into an English lesson and have really high levels of self-efficacy, really feel confident, really enjoy the subject, but that same student may feel very different in maths, for instance. And so an assembly or a few quotes put up on the wall suggesting that they have a growth mindset is unlikely to be effective.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I agree. And I think growth mindset started off in school with the very best intentions, didn't it? But it just became overly simplified. And I think you've hit the nail on the head that so much of what we do is domain specific. And, we've certainly learned that in our work, haven't we? Even with things like, CPD, like so much of the CPD that we do now is within the subject, isn't it? It has to be subject specific. Well, a lot of it has to be subject specific if it's going to be useful.
I suppose our CPT has two strands, really, doesn't it? The more general strand, which might look at a wider topic, whether it's one of the six principles or something like vocabulary or the cognitive load we had earlier this year, didn't we, that we looked at. But then it's always about translation down into subject. Going back to Mark's question about what else I would change in the book, we've talked about it a number of times, but actually we wouldn't change the 6 principles, but there might be a slight shift of emphasis. For instance, when Emma McRae wrote the maths book, she found it really difficult to distinguish in maths as a subject area between the idea of explanation and modelling. Because it's almost all explanation in maths, a very sort of academic subject, abstract. All of it needs that sort of that visual modelling as part of it. There's a question that I've asked before, that whether the challenge chapter should be renamed curriculum challenge, or whether the idea of challenge is such a vague idea that it's quite difficult to put your finger on what it means. It might mean something different for each different person.
I think also our knowledge and understanding of a lot of areas of cognitive science back then, certainly weren't as strong as they are now. And there's lots of things that have influenced a lot of our thinking that weren't really explicit in the original book. Cognitive load theory, desirable difficulties, all those sorts of things. I think they were implied within the book, but they weren't really in the forefront, were they?
No. They weren't implied, and we have learned a lot more since those times. I think we've also learned the difficulty. It's very easy to write it in a book and say, "Oh, here's retrieval practice, for instance. Go and do some quizzes." But what we've learned is that at a whole school level, and a sort of subject-specific level, implementing those things is really, really hard.
Yeah, and
really
Mark,
hard.
I've heard Mark Enter talk about this a lot, actually, and he makes a really good point that as teachers, we not only do we have to understand the what behind what we're doing, but also the why. So if we're doing retrieval quizzes, why is that so important in terms of the learning process? And I think that's a really strong point. And of course, the other thing is that our thinking now is framed a lot more around curriculum, teaching, and assessment, isn't it? And I think that's something in the new version of the book that's what we're going to be focusing on, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and the idea with the chapters for the new version of the book is to go over the each of the 6 principles again, to talk about the strategies that are supported most strongly by the evidence. So we will slim those down a bit, and we will have a number of new ones. But then as the chapters move through, we move more and more into talking about implementation. And so the book is, yes, aimed at teachers, and new teachers will find a lot to use in it, but also it's aimed at leaders, or at least people in schools who want to mobilise the evidence beyond their own classroom. And that sort of process, and also the mistakes and difficulties and misconceptions that can form around some of the research evidence. We're going to explore those as we move through the chapters as well. So the chapters move very much from a classroom teaching point of view through to a leadership view.
Another question. This one's from Adam Lawson. When trying new things, how do you bring colleagues out of their comfort zones? It's a good one.
You're giving that one to me. I think it takes time, first of all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time, and it takes an awful lot of planning. And you've got to think very carefully about the small steps that people need to take. And I think it's really important that schools and subject areas and curriculum areas are working as teams. So I think, and my personal view on this has moved quite strongly since quite a long way since the original writing. I think that actually teachers have a professional obligation to the profession and to their students to listen to the research evidence and respond to it. And so the question, I think, is couched in a way that might suggest that we have to persuade them and cajole them and, you know, hope for the best. And some people will move and will be early adopters, won't they? And will want to do it. But we also need to be shifting our policies and our expectations of practice within our department areas. So my suggestion would be for anybody who wants to move and improve the teaching of those around them is to choose one or two things that you want to improve. The big mistake, and I've certainly been victim of this both in my own classroom and also working at a broader level, is trying to do too many things at once. So maybe we're going to improve modelling in our department, and we're going to make that a focus for a year. And we're going to expect every teacher, irrespective of experience or their view on teaching and learning, to come along with us. And what you will find, and what we found in the work we've done with other schools and presentations and everything, is that if the approaches are common sense and grounded in real obvious benefits for the children, then some of your recalcitrant sort of armchair sort of critics often come on board.
Well, we find that quite a lot, don't we? When we're talking in schools, often the people that come and speak to us at the end are, probably people that have been labelled the staff room cynics, and they're quite pleased about what we've said because it aligns with what they've probably known for years makes for effective teaching, but they may have been told actually that it doesn't. And I think that's important, and I think that
it creates frustration, doesn't it?
And you're absolutely right. The point that you made is that there's a moral question here. As a profession, why on earth wouldn't we be using the research evidence to educate these young people? Because they get one shot at education, and it would be morally questionable, not to base that, I think, on what the evidence says is most likely to work. Because we never discussed this with our staff, did we, about what the 6 principles should be, what their ideas for the 6 principles would be. It was just, told to them based on the best available evidence. And I think that's the kind of right approach.
Yeah, and what we've found is that this is where the tight but loose scenario comes in, isn't it? That, okay, this is tight, but here you have freedom to think about how this is going to work within your subject area, and we will pass that on to you and your expertise. And that's where you get the creativity, the innovation, and a lot of the original sort of strategies from the book have been taken on, improved beyond measure by teachers that we've worked with in our school, and we've also been lucky enough to work with in other schools. So that for me is how you work you basically you tighten the framework and you raise expectations of staff, but you don't forget about everything that they've learned and their expertise along the way.
Yeah, that's always been a part of our strategy, isn't it? We put the 6 principles out there, but then we've always been really keen to find examples of teachers doing it well, the bright spots we call it, and then share that. So it then becomes a bit of a snowball, and that gives people ownership, doesn't it? And it kind of goes on from there, really. But it's a long process, isn't it? But it's a worthwhile endeavour.
I think so. Just looking at the questions now. So from Mrs. Cav, how did you implement and embed each individual principle as part of your teaching and learning policy? That's a big one. Over to you.
Well, to be honest, there was never a kind of moment when that happened, was there?
No.
Uh, it kind of evolved, and we started talking about the principles, and getting people. At the time, we were doing a lot of 50-minute forums after school, weren't we? And we started to find people who were doing questioning well or feedback well, and we asked them to kind of do 15-minute forums on it, and then it kind of spread from there. I mean, there were obvious things like we had a marking policy at the time, and that became a feedback policy. And rather than being directive about how people should do marking, it talked about principles of effective feedback, and then subjects were given the freedom to interpret that in the way they saw fit, really. I think it's there was never a kind of launch of the six principles. It just kind of evolved and happened over the years, didn't it? Really, and is now an ingrained part of just how we teach and how we talk about teaching.
Yeah, I think if you were a school who were coming from a slightly different angle, and you want some sort of teaching and learning policy that you will use across the school, I think it might be a mistake to just try to sort of impose all six principles in one go.
Yeah, and what we were always very clear about was that it was never turned into a kind of lesson plan, was it?
No.
It was never turned into a tick list for lessons, because there had to be an acceptance that the lesson isn't the unit of learning. It can happen over, and it should happen over time, can't it?
Yeah, the other thing is it's not, it can be a cycle, those principles. Teacher explains something and models it, children practice it, and then there's feedback, and that cycle is a very important part of teaching and learning. But we were always
can vary, can't it? I think
somebody said to me recently, it's fractal. I quite like that notion that actually that might happen over in my subject, English, it might be 5 years that you're teaching children how to write a really strong analytical essay. That's a 5-year process. Within and that will include all six of the principles. Yet within the space of 5 minutes in a lesson, teaching a piece of knowledge or a concept or something you might go through using those principles. You certainly wouldn't expect to see them every lesson, would you?
No, not at all. Because I can think about some of our brilliant art teachers in the past, Gal Christie, Steve Bloomer. They may spend when they're introducing a new approach, they might spend the best part of a lesson explaining and modeling that approach, but then the next couple of lessons are lots and lots of practice with some questions, feedback. So that's the tight but loose thing again, isn't it? But that's also shifting people's understanding of the learning process, isn't it? And the whole thing about learning versus performance, and we've spent a lot of time talking to staff about that. And again, you have to have an understanding of that to kind of really understand how the six principles operate, don't you? I think
that's right. And I think that the new book, the six principles, we're going to spend a fair bit of time showing how that's married to curriculum design, because it's all very well showing off those six principles in lessons, but unless the curriculum is designed well in a subject-specific way, and there's acceptance that the learning journey, the story of the learning, the curriculum itself, the principles support the implementation of the curriculum, and that's where we feel that they fit and they sit as one cog in the much broader experience that the children have in school.
Right, last question from our ex-Durrington colleague Todd Brennan. I don't think it was a question directly aimed at us, but it's a good question anyway. What has been the most influential research on your teaching?
Now that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because does he mean a piece of research, so as a one paper,
Yeah.
or does he mean a sort of a finding? And I think what we have to be careful of as teachers is giving too much weight to one particular paper.
Yeah.
That's why I'm really fond of, like you mentioned earlier, the Rosenshine, which is a synthesis of 30 years of research into different areas. I'm fond of the Great Teaching. I'm fond of the EEF guidance reports, because actually it's about principles, isn't it? And it's about finding um, key best bets across the board and working on those. For me, over the last few years, it has been the cognitive science stuff. If I could look at one book, it would be the Willingham book, Why Don't Children Like School? And if I could look at one idea which has been fundamental, and many people have said it's that idea that memory is the residue of thought, or I think it was Graham Nuttall, it might not have been, who said that we remember what we think about. That's just so important for curriculum design, for all of the work that we do with the 6 principles, getting children thinking and learning and remembering.
I was going
What
to
about
say,
you?
well, I was going to say the same actually. I think that sentence from Willingham, "Memory is the residue of thought," just unlocks so much really. And if you understand the kind of thinking behind that, it just makes everything clear really. I agree with all the things that you talked about. I think also Rodigger's work on retrieval practice, that's been really important. The Bjork's on desirable difficulties, again, that's a really important idea to understand, I think. And I mean, I think Todd told me off earlier on because I responded to that tweet with a list of different ones, and he did say that wasn't what he wanted. But so
there we go. So at the moment we're writing the new book, and as I said before, we're really thinking about how we can show some of the new research that we've encountered and put into practice. How we can show how we can put that into practice within the framework of the 6 principles. We're going to think about how the 6 principles marry with the current emphasis on curriculum design, and most of all, I think we're going to think about, okay, we've got these 6 principles, but how do we mobilize them? How do we implement them? How do we ensure that they actually work to improve the learning and the life chances of children in schools? Anything you would add to that?
No. I think it's really exciting because I think the 6 principles are still really valid, and I think they always will be. But looking at them with fresh eyes, with the cognitive science stuff, is going to be great. And I think what will be interesting is perhaps to do some more of these, but to invite some of the other Melk authors, Emma, Chris, and ask them to reflect on how they've approached it in their subjects and in their schools as well. So perhaps that's the next plan.
Brilliant.
Good. I hope people have enjoyed that, and you've enjoyed looking at my walk up there.
And hopefully my excitable 8-year-old, locked down at the moment, let's be fair, hasn't ruined the sound quality in the background. Thank you for watching and listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Take care and stay well.